The Ardennes forest in Belgium has always carried an uneasy silence, a place where mist rolls low and the air feels older than time itself. In November 1991, 3 Belgian soldiers, Corporal Leon Marchand, Sergeant Thomas Vervoort, and Private Jules Nielsen, were assigned to a late-night patrol through the dense woodland near the southern ridge. It was meant to be routine, a 2-hour circuit, radio check-ins every 30 minutes, and back to base before midnight. They left at 2100 hours, driving a standard olive-green military jeep loaded with minimal supplies, a field map, and 1 camera used to document terrain conditions. The last radio transmission came at 2247. Thomas had checked in, saying they were heading east through a fog bank, but would complete their route shortly. His tone was calm. Nothing seemed wrong. By morning, when they still hadn't returned, the base assumed their radio had failed. By noon, when their sector remained unresponsive, search teams were dispatched. Helicopters circled the treetops, but the canopy was too thick to see through. The ground teams found only faint tire tracks that led several hundred meters off the marked road before stopping abruptly as if the jeep had simply disappeared into thin air. 1 flashlight lay on the mud, still faintly glowing, its beam cutting through the mist like a memory that refused to die. There were no footprints, no signs of panic, no indication of a crash or ambush. The forest, in its cold silence, had swallowed them whole. The military investigation dragged on for months, but with no vehicle, no remains, and no leads, the case was quietly closed. The official report labeled it loss due to terrain misnavigation, though everyone involved knew that was just a convenient phrase for something that made no sense. The soldiers' families didn't accept it. Leon's sister, Claire, began visiting the forest every month, tying small red ribbons to trees as if marking a trail her brother might one day follow home. Thomas's wife, Elise, wrote dozens of letters to the Ministry of Defense asking for reinvestigation, none of which were answered. Private Nielsen's parents eventually left Belgium altogether, unable to live near the forest that had taken their son. Rumors spread quickly among locals. Hunters said they sometimes heard an engine start deep in the woods around midnight, then fade away as if sinking underground. Some claimed they seen faint headlights moving through the fog where no roads existed. The forest had a reputation long before 1991, filled with stories of lost soldiers from World War II, tunnels carved by the Germans that were never mapped or sealed, and strange flickering lights that vanished when approached. But for 15 years, those were just stories, until 2006. That spring, a forestry team clearing fallen branches along the southern ridge uncovered a patch of metal under thick layers of moss. At first, they assumed it was old machinery left from wartime, but when the mud was scraped away, a green military jeep emerged remarkably intact despite the years. The Army insignia was still visible on the doors, and the license plate matched the one from the missing patrol. Inside were 3 helmets resting on the seats, clean and dry, as if untouched by time. The keys were still in the ignition. When one of the workers half-jokingly turned the switch, the dashboard lights flickered to life. For a moment, the forest around them felt like it was holding its breath. News spread fast. Military investigators sealed off the area within hours. Reporters, locals, and even a few of the soldiers' surviving relatives arrived at the site, their faces pale as they stared at something that should have been long gone. There were no bodies, no evidence of decay, no trace that anyone had been inside for years, yet everything looked exactly as it would have on that night in 1991. The mud under the tires was soft, freshly disturbed, as if the vehicle had been driven there recently. It was impossible. One of the investigators later admitted that what unsettled him most wasn't the jeep itself, it was the forest's silence, the sense that the trees were watching. When they finally opened the glove compartment, they found a small sealed envelope marked in fading ink, marked, "For whoever finds this, we didn't mean to go this far." The handwriting matched Corporal Marchand's. When investigators carefully unfolded the weathered envelope found in the Jeep's glove compartment, the paper inside crackled softly, still dry despite 15 years in the damp forest. The letter was written in neat, hurried script, the kind that suggested shaking hands. Corporal Leon Marchand had signed it at the bottom, but his words were what chilled the room. He wrote that they had gotten lost somewhere off the map, where compasses spun endlessly and radio signals turned into static whispers that almost sounded like voices. He mentioned hearing another engine following them though they were alone, and seeing old war relics that weren't there seconds later. His last line was simple but haunting. "We saw the lights again last night. If anyone finds this, don't look for us. This place isn't ours anymore." The investigators, many of whom were veterans themselves, exchanged uneasy glances. There were no coordinates, no clear directions, nothing to explain how a jeep could remain perfectly preserved in the forest's brutal winters. But the condition of the letter, no mold, no fading ink, paper crisp as new, suggested it hadn't been there for 15 years. The military brought in forensic analysts who confirmed the handwriting as authentic, but couldn't explain the lack of aging. Even the dust inside the glove box was minimal, as if time had been reset around the vehicle. A deeper inspection of the Jeep revealed stranger details. The fuel tank was half full, the tires had fresh air, and the battery, though weak, still held charge. One of the mechanics noted that the odometer showed a reading of only 20 kilometers since its last logged maintenance in 1991, meaning it had barely moved before disappearing. Around the site, soil samples indicated recent disturbance. The moss covering the vehicle had grown for at least a decade, but the earth beneath the tires was soft, freshly pressed. The contradictions didn't make sense to anyone. Later, that week, a geophysical team scanned the surrounding area using ground-penetrating radar and found signs of hollow spaces beneath the forest floor, tunnels or chambers roughly 10 meters below. Old wartime blueprints confirmed that a network of German bunkers had once run through this region, many sealed off after World War II. Local archives mention several collapses, but none near the coordinates where the Jeep was found. The investigators decided to excavate a small section, uncovering a rusted steel door embedded in the ground, partly hidden by tree roots. It was locked from the inside. When they forced it open, a cold wave of air escaped, heavy with the smell of metal and earth. Inside was a narrow corridor lined with rotting wooden beams. No footprints, no animal traces, just silence. About 20 meters in, they found a small metal box containing military film rolls. The labels matched the equipment log of the missing soldiers. When developed, the photos were murky and fragmented, but several images stood out. One showed the three men standing by their Jeep at night, smiling, unaware it would be their last known picture. Another, taken moments later, showed streaks of light between the trees, thin, vertical bands, too bright for normal flash reflection. The final photo was blurred, as if the camera had been snatched mid-shot, capturing only movement and distorted light. Forensics confirmed the film stock was authentic to the early 1990s, yet the chemical aging was inconsistent, as if the photos had been developed recently, not stored for 15 years underground. The discovery spread through the ranks quietly, but rumors reached the press anyway. Some called it a hoax. Others said it proved the soldiers had found a hidden war bunker and were trapped inside for years. But the lead investigator, Captain Alain Drovin, privately told a colleague something stranger. During the excavation, his team's GPS equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Readings would jump backward in time, showing timestamps from 1991. Radios emitted faint bursts of chatter that matched the missing patrol's call sign. The military officially dismissed these as signal anomalies caused by mineral interference, But every man in that tunnel knew something unnatural lingered there. That night, as the site was sealed off, one of the guards stationed near the ridge reported seeing faint headlights deep between the trees, moving slowly, turning as if searching for a road. When he approached, they vanished. He followed the trail until dawn, but found nothing, only 3 sets of boot prints that ended abruptly near the Jeep. No one could say if they were fresh or 15 years old. And yet, for reasons no one could explain, the soil beneath them was warm to the touch. A week after the Jeep's discovery, the Belgian Defense Ministry ordered the tunnels sealed again, but Captain Alain Droven refused to leave without understanding what really happened. He convinced his superior officers to let him conduct one final sweep, officially to verify safety conditions, though everyone knew he was searching for answers. With 2 engineers and a camera operator, he descended into the narrow passage where the metal box of film had been found. The air inside felt unnaturally still, thick enough to slow their breathing. The walls were damp, etched with faded German inscriptions from World War II, but there were also newer scratches, initials and crude arrows pointing deeper inside. The handwriting didn't match anything military. As they moved further, the tunnel curved and began sloping downward. The deeper they went, the more their equipment malfunctioned. The radio crackled with distorted voices, repeating words none of them could clearly understand. One of the engineers, a veteran named Rogier, claimed he heard his name whispered behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing but the echo of their own footsteps. The corridor ended in a collapsed chamber with what looked like remnants of wooden crates and torn uniforms half buried in the dirt. Droven brushed the debris aside and found something that made his stomach tighten, a patch from the Belgian army with Leon Marchand's name stitched on it, still attached to a sleeve. The fabric wasn't decayed, and when touched, it was dry and warm, as though it hadn't been underground for long. They documented everything, took photographs, and began their ascent, but when they replayed the footage later, parts of it were missing. Segments of the recording had been replaced by static, while the timestamps on the camera reset to 1991, the very day the patrol vanished. Back at the base, Droven tried to piece together the timeline, but nothing added up. The tunnel system wasn't on any official maps, and the coordinates on their GPS from that day showed a location several kilometers away from where they had actually been. His team members began acting strange. Roger refused to return to the site and claimed he woke up hearing faint engine sounds outside his window every night. The other engineer stopped answering calls altogether and filed a request to be transferred out of the unit. Droven himself noticed something subtle but unsettling. His wristwatch stopped working every time he drove near the forest, and when he checked the dashboard clock in his vehicle, it always showed 22:47, the last recorded time of the missing soldier's transmission. 2 days later, Droven received a call from a local historian named Dr. Marie Hallett, who had been studying wartime anomalies in the Ardennes for years. She had heard about the discovery and requested to meet him privately. When they met in a small cafe outside Namur, she showed him old German documents describing an experimental radio project conducted in the Ardennes during the final months of World War II. Equipment designed to transmit signals through terrain using high-frequency pulses. The project was abandoned after several operators went missing, and the last recorded test site was near the same ridge where the Jeep was found. Hallett believed those signals might have continued to echo underground for decades, creating electromagnetic pockets that could distort instruments, maybe even perception of time itself. Droven wasn't convinced, but her explanation was the only thing that made sense. That evening, he returned to the forest alone, carrying the letter found in the Jeep. The air felt colder than before, and the fog had thickened into a heavy wall that seemed to breathe. He followed the trail until he reached the site, now fenced off and silent except for the distant hum of wind through the branches. He stood before the Jeep, placed his hand on the cold metal hood, and whispered the soldiers' names under his breath. For a moment, the ground beneath him vibrated softly like a buried engine idling far below. Then, faintly through the mist, he heard it, the rhythmic hum of an old Jeep engine starting, echoing through the trees before fading into silence once more. He left the forest that night, shaken and pale, and by morning he filed his final report, anomalous sight, recommend permanent closure. But he didn't tell anyone what he heard. Only weeks later would investigators notice something strange in the photo logs from that night. A final image captured automatically by the camera mounted on the Jeep, showing 3 silhouettes in uniform standing near the edge of the ridge, staring towards the forest as though waiting for someone to return. In the weeks that followed, Captain Elaine Droven's life began to quietly unravel. Officially, the case was closed again, the tunnels sealed, the Jeep removed for further preservation, and all reports locked under classified clearance. But Droven couldn't let it go. The image of those 3 silhouettes near the ridge haunted him, their outlines sharp and unmistakable, even through the haze of the camera lens. He had gone through every frame, convinced that what he saw wasn't a camera glitch. Their stances, their posture, it looked exactly like the missing soldiers, frozen in the moment they vanished 15 years ago. He started waking up at night to the faint echo of an engine turning over somewhere in the distance, the sound cutting through the stillness of his rural home like a memory refusing to fade. He told himself it was just the wind, maybe distant farm machinery, but he knew the difference. The sound had rhythm, an unmistakable pattern that matched the Jeep's 4-stroke motor. He began spending more time alone, going through old radio logs, scanning static frequencies late at night, and replaying archived transmissions from 1991. One evening, around midnight, while reviewing the last known broadcast from Sergeant Thomas Vervoort, something happened that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the static, there was a faint voice saying his own name. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, the kind you'd hear when a vehicle's turn signal is left on. He replayed it over and over until he realized the pattern matched the exact rhythm of the Jeep's indicator system. He stayed up the rest of the night, headphones pressed tight, trying to trace where the signal came from, but each time he triangulated it, the coordinates led him back to the forest. Unable to stay away, Droven drove there the next morning, ignoring every official restriction. The forest was colder now, the trees bare and brittle, the ground wet with winter rain. As he walked toward the ridge, fog rolled in like a tide. His compass needle spun wildly. He followed the same trail he had taken weeks earlier, past the sealed tunnel entrance and the markers left by his team. The place felt emptier than before, as if something had been erased from it. Yet halfway down the path, he noticed something impossible: fresh tire tracks. The tread pattern was identical to the Willys Jeep's military tires from the early 1990s. He followed them deeper until they disappeared into a patch of dead leaves. The forest around him was utterly silent, but he could feel a low vibration underfoot, like a pulse buried in the ground. He pulled the letter from his pocket, the one written by Marchand, and read it again, his breath fogging in the cold air. "We saw the lights again last night. If anyone finds this, don't look for us." For a long time he stood there, trying to imagine what those final hours must have felt like. 3 men surrounded by endless dark, their instruments failing, hearing something they couldn't explain. He wondered if they had walked into one of those electromagnetic pockets Dr. Hellett had mentioned, a space where time folded on itself. Or maybe they had simply found something that wasn't meant to be found. The thought struck him suddenly. What if the Jeep hadn't been preserved all those years, but had only just returned from wherever it had gone? That night, Droven drove back to Namur and met Dr. Hallett again, this time looking worn and unshaven. She listened quietly as he described the sounds, the tracks, the strange feeling of vibration beneath the soil. Instead of dismissing him, she opened an old notebook filled with diagrams of frequency waveforms. These were recorded in 1944, German operators testing deep transmission frequencies. The last entry mentions temporal echo distortion. They believed they were bending time signals backward. She leaned forward. "What if those soldiers didn't die, Captain? What if they slipped into one of those echoes?" He didn't know how to answer. Everything in him wanted to reject it, but his body trembled with recognition. It explained the fresh soil, the untouched Jeep, the warm fabric, the letters that hadn't aged. They hadn't been buried for 15 years. They had been gone somewhere else, and only now had the forest given them back. But why the letter? Why the warning not to look? Unable to sleep, Droven once more toward the forest before dawn, ignoring the rising fog and the warnings echoing in his head. When he reached the ridge, the air was unnaturally still. He called out the soldiers' names one last time: Marchand, Vervoort, Nielsen, and waited. At first there was nothing. Then came the faint hum of an engine starting in the distance. He froze. The sound grew louder, moving closer until he could feel it in his chest. Through the trees, a pair of dim headlights appeared, weaving slowly through the fog. He raised his flashlight and stepped forward, heart pounding. The Jeep rolled into view, its paint gleaming faintly, its windshield clean, no driver inside. It stopped just a few feet away from him, idling softly. For a long moment, he stared at it, unable to breathe. Then, just as suddenly, the engine cut off. The fog thickened. When it cleared a few seconds later, the Jeep was gone. When Droven returned to base that morning, pale and speechless, he filed one last note to the ministry. Site unstable. Recommend permanent quarantine. Personnel not recovered. He resigned the next day and never spoke publicly again. Yet every year, on the night of November 18th, the anniversary of the patrol's disappearance, residents near the southern ridge still report seeing two faint headlights moving slowly between the trees, stopping at the same bend in the trail, waiting as if someone's still out there trying to find their way home. Months passed after Captain Elaine Droven's resignation, and the forest returned to silence. The site was officially sealed, barbed wire stretched around the ridge, and the public was told it was due to unstable terrain. But within the Defense Ministry, a few quiet investigations continued. Droven had left behind several boxes of notes, photos, and one unmarked cassette tape that he had never submitted through official channels. The tape was found by an archivist cleaning out his office, its label handwritten in black ink, Ardennes, November 18. At first, no one thought much of it, but when a technician played it, the room fell into an eerie stillness. The first minute was silent, except for faint wind and distant forest sounds. Then came the unmistakable sound of a Jeep's engine turning over, followed by Droven's voice, steady but strained. "If this is recording," he said, "I'm near the ridge again. It's 22:47 exactly. I can hear the engine. It's close." What followed was a long stretch of static, then the faint echo of another man's voice, distant, garbled, almost pleading. Some claimed it said his name. Others thought it was the same line repeated over and over, "Don't follow." When the tape ended, the ministry classified it immediately, but the technician who first heard it later claimed that when he replayed the recording alone that night, there was something new that hadn't been there before. Footsteps crunching leaves, a door creaking open, and then, faintly, a voice whispering the date again and again. The following morning, that same technician resigned, refusing to explain why. Droven himself disappeared 2 months later. His car was found parked near the southern ridge, his personal belongings still inside, but no sign of him. Search efforts were brief and discreet. No one wanted to reopen the case that had already become a source of unease and embarrassment for the military. It wasn't until years later, in 2018, that a civilian hiking group accidentally stumbled across the sealed tunnel site. Erosion had loosened part of the hill, revealing the metal door Droven's team had once uncovered. Inside, the air was cold and dry, undisturbed. The hikers found several rusted tools, remnants of barricades, and at the far end, what looked like a narrow shaft descending deeper underground. They didn't go down, but they took photos, Images later analyzed by experts who noticed something peculiar in the background. 3 shadowy figures standing at the edge of the tunnel, facing the camera, though no one present remembered seeing them. The hikers reported the discovery to authorities, but by the time a new investigation team arrived, the shaft had caved in completely. It was as if the forest had decided to close its mouth once more. The reopened inquiry reviewed all of Drovan's files. His handwriting became more erratic toward the end, his notes filled with sketches of spirals, waveforms, and coordinates that repeated in exact intervals. One note stood out. It read, "The Jeep wasn't preserved, it returned." He had underlined the word returned several times. Attached to the same file was a photograph of the tunnel wall. When enhanced digitally, faint writing appeared, almost etched into the stone. Still driving, still lost. Forensic tests showed the marks were old, possibly decades, but carved by something metallic, perhaps a tool. What disturbed analysts most was that the letters matched Corporal Marchand's known handwriting. A theory began forming quietly among those who reviewed the evidence, shared only in private. The soldiers hadn't simply vanished, they'd slipped into some kind of distortion field, a remnant of the wartime radio experiments that bent electromagnetic frequencies. Perhaps in those deep tunnels, the space between seconds had stretched into years. For the men inside, maybe only a few hours had passed before they returned unchanged to a world that had moved 15 years ahead. But the Jeep, the letter, and the photographs all hinted at something stranger still. If the soldiers had found a way back, why weren't they there when the Jeep was discovered? And who or what had placed the helmets so neatly on the seats? The final piece came unexpectedly. In 2020, a local researcher named Willem Cortez acquired access to a declassified archive from an old communications division. Among the files was a single degraded audio fragment labeled Ardennes 1991. When cleaned and restored, the recording revealed a voice transmission believed to be from Sergeant Thomas Vervoort, the last one sent before his patrol vanished. The static cleared just enough for a few words to come through. "This isn't fog, the road is folding, tell them," and then silence, replaced by what experts later described as a temporal echo, a sound loop repeating the phrase, "still driving," again and again until the tape ended. No one could explain how a 1991 recording had been mislabeled and stored in a 1970s file cabinet, nor why the audio signal showed irregular frequency peaks matching those found in Drovan's recordings nearly 2 decades later. It was as if both transmissions, separated by time, were linked through the same anomaly. After that discovery, the ministry finally sealed all records under the code Operation L47, named after the last known timestamp of the missing patrol. Today, the Ardennes Ridge remains closed to the public. Locals say the forest feels heavier there, the air thicker, the birds avoiding that stretch entirely. On cold nights, hikers swear they can still hear an engine turning somewhere in the mist,